Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I'll be your host. This is Pierre-Auguste Renoir and Impressionism at the Art Institute of Chicago, our latest art history program. Thank you so much for joining us. So this is the first in a four-part series on Renoir. The first one featured Renoir's works at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The second one featured Renoir works at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. If you didn't get a chance to see those yet, or if you want to watch them again, they're on our YouTube channel, which is called Washington, D.C. History and Culture. Our program today, which we're recording, is going to be featuring Renoir's works at the Art Institute of Chicago. And then later this summer, we'll be featuring the Renoir works at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. So thanks so much for joining us. So we are off to Chicago, one of the world's great cities. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and I used to spend a lot of time in Chicago, going there for long weekends and, among other things, seeing the Art Institute of Chicago. So that's where we're off to today. And if you haven't been to Chicago, or I guess even if you have, one of my favorite websites is TripAdvisor, and TripAdvisor is to like tourist attractions, what Yelp is to restaurants and things like that. And according to the readers or viewers of TripAdvisor, these are the top 10 things to go do in Chicago. And you'll notice up at the top is the Art Institute of Chicago, followed by Millennium Park and the Chicago Architecture Center, the Museum of Science and Industry, the Magnificent Mile, Cloud Gate, Wrigley Field, the Willis, formerly the Sears Tower, the Field Museum, and the John Hancock Center. But notice that the Art Institute of Chicago is at the top of the list. So that's pretty cool. And it's one of the world's great art museums. And so I thought we would do a live stream program about their collection. And in this particular program, we'll be featuring the work of, and Chicago has a great collection of Renoir's works. So it makes sense we talk about that. My name is Robert. I'll be your host. A little bit about myself. I grew up in the Detroit, Michigan area. I was an art history major at the University of Michigan, and I spent the first 2 years of my career at the Detroit Institute of Arts. But the first museum that I went to outside of the Detroit area was the Art Institute of Chicago. And so it's always been a sentimental favorite of mine. I was really blown away by the experience and just the architecture, the building, and the amazing collection. And Chicago is such a great place. So this museum really had a big impact on me personally. And so happy to share all of that with you. And I'm currently joining you from Dallas, Texas, where I live now. And we also have our amazing co-host Patty joining us, the pride of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Hi, Patty. How are you? What's going on up in Portsmouth?
Oh, geez. Spring is happening finally. So
All right.
we're thrilled with that. Yeah. And I'm going to put in a plug for my pet favorite, Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston.
All
I'm a
right.
great Boston person from beginning. And yeah, I was literally just before I joined you here, I was reading an article on a restoration case involving the Art Institute of Chicago. They're so complicated and so fascinating, all the processes that go into that World War II recovered art.
Oh, yeah. No, there is a lot of interesting stories behind that subject. Well, thanks, Patty. Thanks for joining us. Patty, if you don't mind, let us know how things go with this new Zoom format. Good, bad, or indifferent, please let us know. Greatly appreciate that.
Will do. Oh, Jan is saying the cicadas are coming out in northern Illinois. So
Oh, wow. Well, that's interesting. Thanks, Jan. Hi, Brad. We also have our good friend Brad joining us from Falling Waters, West Virginia. What's happening in WV, Mr. Brad?
Well, spring is springing, but it seems to like rain more than sun. So we already had all our spring flowers, but then we've been having the rains after instead of the other way around.
Oh, I see. Well, that's interesting.
And I guess my favorite museum in Chicago would be the number 4 on your list, the Museum of Science and Industry. But I to be blunt, I've never been to the Art Institute, so I'm looking
Oh, that's
forward
okay.
a lot from these sessions.
Okay, well, that's no problem at all. Thanks, Brad, so much for joining us. Great. Of course, thanks again, Patty, as well. So, if you're not familiar with the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago, it's one of the world's great museums. These are two of their more famous painting, Impressionist works. They're by American artists Grant Wood and Edward Hopper. But in terms of, like, say, Impressionism collections in the United States, there's really three that are kind of head and shoulders above all the other ones. The Metropolitan Museum in New York has the best collection. And then after that, and maybe a close tied for second would be the Art Institute of Chicago and the National Art. And you get a chance, you really, really need to visit this museum if you like art. They just have an incredible collection. Here are a couple works by Monet and Degas, Manet, Mary Cassatt, Paul Cézanne, and et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of well-known, famous, important Impressionist works by a variety of different artists. And you really could spend several hours just looking at the Impressionism collection in Chicago, but they have a lot of other great artworks as well. They have the second largest collection of Van Gogh paintings in the Western Hemisphere. So good reason to visit there as well. And then so because I like the Art Institute of Chicago so much, this is actually the first of a series of programs we'll be doing on their collection. So we'll be talking about Renoir tonight. Tomorrow, and then again on July 12th, we'll be talking about Monet. And then in June, we'll be talking about Georgia O'Keeffe's New York, because the Art Institute of Chicago is having a big Georgia O'Keeffe exhibit featuring the works that she made when she was living in New York. So I thought I'd give a preview of that in the month of June. So you can be on the lookout for that. All right, so Renoir, he was born on February 25th, 1841. He lived a long life. He passed away in 1919 at the ripe old age of 78. He pretty much continued painting up until the time he passed away. And here are two great self-portraits that Renoir did of himself. And then this was feedback I got from the group a while ago, asking like, hey, can you kind of highlight the key points of your talks? So here's like the Cliff's Notes version. So Renoir, the reason why he's important and well known and well liked, he was one of the founders of the Impressionism movement, along with Monet and Degas and Manet and others. If you categorize his style, we would say his works are beautiful with warm colors, and he really focuses on a lot of light. And then in terms of style, he also does a lot of you call pretty and pleasant things. He was never really anything bad or dark or disturbing. And he was works by choice. We'll talk about why that is a little bit later. In terms of his primary subjects, usually focused on women, often either fashionably dressed or sometimes nude. Additional subjects that he portrayed were modern Paris life, genre and leisure scenes, children, landscapes, still lifes, etc. He had a lot of close friends in the artistic movement, including Claude Monet, and he had a lot of wealthy patrons. That's really something that differentiates Renoir from someone, say, like Van Gogh, who was having a hard time selling his work. And then I guess if you had to summarize Renoir's works, you could say they were lovely, or are lovely and exquisite. All right, so where was Renoir from? Was he from Chicago? No, he was from central France. Again, he was born in February of 1841. This is the town where he grew up in. It's about 240 miles or 400 kilometers south of Paris. And Renoir gets his start in the artistic world by working in a porcelain factory in his hometown. Now, originally, he was just one of the kind of laborers, so to speak. But over time, people, the factory realized that he had a talent for art. And so he got promoted to actually painting the porcelain. So this is interesting. He gets to start doing this type of work. And he got to showcase his artistic abilities to a certain degree. He had a lot of limitations, of course, painting porcelain, not a lot of freedom in that pursuit. And Renoir has interesting parents. His mom was a seamstress. This is a portrait that he did of her in a private collection. And then this is Renoir's father. He was a tailor and dressmaker. And I wanted to show you a few other works by Renoir at other museums, so you can kind of see how all of his career's output kind of fits together. So we'll include mostly works from the Art Institute of Chicago, but include a few other paintings as well, just so you can kind of see how things fit together. So it's important to note, though, that Renoir's parents were in, like, say, the clothing and fashion business, because a lot of his works, the attention to detail on clothes, particularly women's clothes, is very noteworthy. So something for you to be Oh, Stephanie says Renoir's dad looks so serious. Yeah, Renoir's dad was not a proponent of his son's chosen profession, and that led to some conflict life for us. So even though he was from, say, South Central France, but eventually ends up in Paris. And it's there that he starts interacting with this young group of artists that we become known as Impressionists. So Renoir is not actually in this photo, but he would go to salons and classes and cafes and things like that. And he artists. And look at these three portraits of a young Renoir. So one thing that's funny about Renoir, even though he's a famous artist, a lot of people, I would guess, don't know what he looked like. And so I would imagine if I walked up to 100 random people on the street and asked them who this was, that not many would know it, Renoir. Even if you did that in a museum, I've done that before, and a lot of people don't recognize what Renoir looks like. He's not as famous, say, in the looks department as Van Gogh or Frida Kahlo or, say, Picasso. And then a friend of Renoir's was the writer Emile Zola. And he wrote this quote kind of more in general, but I really think it pertains to Renoir. There are two men inside the artists, the poet and the craftsman. One is born a poet, one becomes a craftsman. So we kind of saw that craftsman aspect of Renoir's life. He was working in a porcelain factory. This is one of my favorite Renoir paintings because it's located at my former employer, the Detroit Institute of Arts, Women in Armchair from 1874. And then here's another great work by Renoir. So again, showing you a few other paintings outside of Chicago, just so you can see how things fit in. And I'll go through his work in mostly chronological order, just so you can see how things develop and evolve over time. And this is the first work we're going to talk to that's in the Chicago Museum. This is Lunch at a Restaurant from 1874. This is one of the iconic early Impressionism paintings. Renoir here is depicting modern Paris life. Renoir liked to go to cafes and things like that. So it's not unlike him to include this type of set works. Restaurants and cafes were really becoming a popular thing at this point in time. Look at the beautiful colors in this painting and the beautiful light as you see these people here relaxing on a nice spring or summer day. And you can see off in the distance people rowing in boats. You have one person here, and then you have another group of people here, and they're just sitting around here very casually. Here's a close-up. And in the full view. And so why was this a important Impressionist? Well, because restaurants and cafes had kind of come into their own around this time. I'm guessing most of you eat at restaurants and on a regular basis these days. But back in, say, the mid 1800s, that was not the case. But it's around this time that Impressionism is being born in the 1870s, that restaurants and cafes are becoming popular. People at this time have more disposable income. They have more leisure time, and this became a really popular thing for people to do. You don't really see restaurants and cafes depicted in paint 50 years earlier because it wasn't that popular of a thing to do. At that point in time, people usually ate at home. And so Renoir is not the only one who's frequently painting this subject matter. The painting on the left is at the Art Institute of Chicago, and the painting on the right is at the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C. It's another one of Renoir's famous works. And you can see a lot of similarities and a few differences between these two works. So if you're ever in Washington, D.C., in addition to going to the Smithsonian and the National Gallery of Art, make sure you check out the Phillips collection. They have a great art collection as well. And this is Luncheon of the Boating Party from 1880, 1881. And here's a field view of that work. And then the one in Chicago. And two side by side, so you can see a lot of similarities and again a few differences. These two paintings were actually done at the same restaurant outside of Paris. And notice the subject matter, these people that are having a good time. Renoir really focuses on kind of positive aspects of human life. You don't see things like death and destruction in his artworks. And this is a letter that Renoir wrote to a friend of his, inviting him to come to the restaurant. You do well to choose a day and come to lunch. You will not be sorry you made the trip. This is the most attractive spot in the countryside in Paris, said Renoir to his friend, inviting him to lunch. And so again, you have this kind of growing middle class, the bourgeoisie, so to speak, with their increased leisure time and increased incomes, and they're spending time in restaurants. All right, so here's this restaurant. So here's downtown. And then our geography lesson is the restaurants over here. Now, this particular place has really been kind of surrounded by the Parisian sprawl, so to speak. But when Renoir was living here, this was kind of like a very rural area. So if you go visit this restaurant now, which you can because it's still open, it was out in the country, and now it's really part of the city. Here's a postcard over from back in the day. Stephanie asked, is the restaurant around? Yes, it is. I'll show you the menu in just a moment. And this is where those paintings were done. You can see this up here on the second floor. There was two of them, and that's where these paintings were done. And then here's another view. Here's the terraces right here. And then this is the Seine River. Notice all these boats here, all these people out here having a good time. And so people would come out to the country to go boating. And this would be a popular place to visit either before or after your boat experience. And then here's some information on the restaurant. It was opened in 1887. The restaurant was and this is part of the menu. And you can see they have the painting actually on the menu. So that's pretty cool. Whoops, let me go back. The restaurant was a favorite of Renoir, who painted scenes of the restaurant, including lunch at the Restaurant Fournet and rowers' lunch and luncheon of the boating party, as well as several portraits of the family members and landscapes, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's still a restaurant you can go visit. It is more recent times. And here it is today. So now, if you go here, again, this is in the middle of, not really in the middle of, in the city of Paris. So these big, tall things were not there when Renoir was here. This bridge across here was not there. So it would have been a much more rural atmosphere. Again, here's our rowers taking a break for lunch.
Robert, I'm going to interrupt you because a lot of people are saying that your voice is breaking up, and right now I can't hear you at all.
Uh-oh, that's not good. I wonder why that is. Let's see. Let me do this. Let me take a break for one moment. Let me take a 60-second break. I'll check the sound, and then we'll start back. Hold on for 1 second.
Yeah, some people are saying it's fine, and other people are saying they're getting breakup, which I was getting myself.
All right, hold on for one moment. Okay, let's try this and see how that works.
Sounds
Are you
pretty
still
strong.
there? Can you hear me? Oh, good.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, let's try. Appreciate that.
Whoops, now I lost you again.
Uh-oh. Okay, what about, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yeah, I'll
Okay,
let you know
cool.
if it starts breaking up again.
Oh, good. Thank you. I appreciate that. Sorry for the technical problems. Let's continue on. So again, you can visit this restaurant. It's still open. It's a very historic place to visit. You can imagine it gets a lot of tourists. And so imagine Renoir's figures here enjoying lunch. And you can do the same thing, sitting at one of these tables overlooking the Seine. And so this is where he ends up painting these two works of art. And this is around the time that Impressionism is getting going in the early to mid 1870s. So this is a classic example of early Impressionism. It's an interesting painting in the sense that on the one hand, it's kind of like a portrait of these three friends of his, but on the other hand, it's like a landscape painting. If you look in the middle and the top of the painting, the background of the Seine River with the boaters, and then this beautiful light and colors that Renoir is highlighting. And one of the more famous works of art in the Art Institute of Chicago is Edward Hopper's Nighthawks. And what does this have to do with Impressionism? Well, absolutely nothing. It's just a cool painting. I wanted people to know that was in Chicago. But look at the different kind of approach that Hopper and Renoir took in somewhat of a similar subject matter. Three people hanging out in a cafe or a restaurant. Now, one is in France, the other is set in New York City. One's during the day, one's at night. But two great paintings in Chicago of the same subject matter by different artists, done about, let's see, 67 years apart. And so interesting compare and contrast there.
This is a great example of what is and isn't impressionism because the light is very contained. Anywhere there is light, it's contained. And in the Renoir, of course, it's the whole subject is light.
Yeah, it's funny how two different artists paint the same subject, but take very different approaches. But yeah, Patty, appreciate that. A great example between, like, say, Impressionism and the more modern looking work on the right. And then here are Renoir's friends. So Renoir would frequently depict friends of his in his paintings, and he did that here. The gentleman on the left, you might recognize, he's in a few other famous Renoir paintings in particular. All right, so I put a star by this because this is one of the key quotes, or key kind of philosophical ideas of Renoir. He said in a letter to a friend, "Why shouldn't art be pretty? There are enough unpleasant things in the world." And so you don't see death and destruction and bad things like that in Renoir's works. He really wants to highlight these pretty and pleasant things. And you see a great example of that here with this woman in this beautiful home playing the piano, and this is Woman at the Piano. Now, at this point in time, Renoir is still relatively early in his career. He's been painting for quite a while, but he's 34 years old. He's depicting modern Paris life. And this is an interesting painting because it has a slightly elevated vantage point. So we can kind of look down on the woman and see her hands and the keys and the sheet music and all that kind of stuff. And there's the full view. She's wearing what was called a day dress. So it's kind of like a fancier dress that a woman would wear around the house. You wouldn't really wear this out in public. So that's what her attire is. And then look at the close up of her face on the right. Lori says, yes, please come see us in Chicago. So again, this is Woman at the Piano. Now, this is a great example of a Paris 1870s bourgeoisie home. And why is that? What hints give that away? Well, if you look on the bottom left, you can see the piano and the woman are seated on a imported Persian carpet. Over on the top right, you can see a big ceramic planter. On the top right, you can see a gilded framed painting or print. And then, of course, this big upright piano with the sheet music. So obviously, this is not the home of a poor individual. It was the upper middle class or middle class at this point in time. And throughout history, particularly during this era, it was not uncommon for people, young children, to get piano lessons, particularly girls. Boys got piano lessons as well, but it was thought that this would make girls more cultured and all that kind of stuff. So you frequently see depictions of children taking piano lessons, and I remember when I was a child, people were still taking piano lessons. Although I think maybe it's not quite as popular as it was back then. And Renoir, though, did a number of paintings of this subject, either girls or young women playing the piano. These are some of the same subject in other collections. So this is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York for our friends there. This is at the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. And this is another work that's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And so there they are side by side, the other collections. And then I thought what I would do is I want to play a music piece for just a moment, but I have to pause the YouTube because I don't want to interrupt the copyrights. And we can look at these paintings while listening to music. So imagine the scene on the left or one of the ones on the right being accompanied by this beautiful Debussy music.
Robert, we're not hearing the music.
Oh no, why is that?
I don't know.
All right, well, you know what? Let's skip that. What about now?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay, well, you get the idea. So anyway, sorry, it's a little the Zoom settings with this format a little bit different. I feel like I'm in England driving on the other side of the street trying to navigate through this. So but anyway, this painting is made during what's known as the Belle Epoque, or the beautiful era in French. And Renoir actually really liked music a lot. He was actually thinking about being a singer or a musician very early in his life before he decided to become a painter. And so the painting here is really kind of a combination of his interest in both music and intellectual pursuits. Like, for instance, from a sight standpoint, we have this beautiful woman in this beautiful setting. And if we could imagine as we were listening, hearing her playing this beautiful music. And here's a close-up of her. The people in Renoir's paintings have a very kind of distinctive look, in my opinion, and that's including for her as well. And then here's a friend of Renoir's, Alfred Sisley. He was an Impressionist painter. He's maybe not a household name, but he was friends with Renoir and Monet and some of the other key figures of the Impressionist movement. So he was both a friend and an artist. This particular painting was owned by a woman named Annie Swan Coburn. We'll talk about her in just a moment. Her estate donated the Coburn Renoirs to the Art Institute of Chicago, if you're wondering how they ended up getting such a fabulous art collection. Talk more about her in just a moment. And here is Alfred Sisley, a photograph on the right. And the Art Institute of Chicago has some of his works on display. So here's some examples of his works. If you're looking for maybe a Impressionist painter that you might not be as familiar with, you could check out Alfred Sisley. And here's Renoir's portrait of him, looking very thoughtful. And then here is Annie Swan Coburn and her apartment in the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago. So there's a portrait of her on the right. Look at this room in her apartment in the center. The hotel picture from a postcard is on the left. But look at that. She's got that Renoir painting hanging right above a Monet work that we're going to be talking about in our next program. And then over on the right is a Cezanne. So imagine having these three great Impressionist paintings in your tea room. And that's what she did. And she donated a number of artworks to the museum. So the museum has done a great job and it's been the benefactor of a lot of wealthy Chicago persons over the years who donated their artwork to the museum. So if you're wondering how they got such a great collection, that played a big part in that. You can see the paint on his forehead. And then again, showing you works by Renoir in mostly a chronological order. This is probably his most famous painting. This is a summertime dance in a park in Paris that he did in 1876. And again, happy and pleasant and things like that. These subjects you see in Renoir's works over and over again. Here's another great work of his at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, The Swing, in the same year. And then this is at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. Young couple flirting with one another. And then this work, The Laundress, from 1877 to 1879. So this is an interesting Renoir depiction of working class Paris. The Laundress, you don't really hear much about that anymore, but during this point in time, this was a frequent subject of both literary and visual culture. Laundresses were very commonplace in society because washing and drying clothes was a big endeavor back then. And so Renoir takes a time out kind of from depicting the middle class society to depicting the working class Paris. And this is a different woman, but again, this laundry back in the day was a big job. You could read accounts of women that say were homemakers, and it wouldn't be uncommon for a woman to have to spend one whole day a week doing nothing but laundry. Imagine that. And Emile Zola, we talked about him before. A laundress was a key figure in one of his famous novels. And a lot of Impressionists ended up doing depictions of laundresses because, again, this was a very common profession, particularly for women. So you have Degas in the center and on the left, and then Pissarro on the right. Now, the reason why you don't hear much about laundresses anymore is because in the 1950s, the automatic washer started to become available. And then, of course, later on, the dryer as well. So women didn't have to spend as much time doing laundry work, and neither did men. And then we were talking before, Patty brought up, what exactly is Impressionism? And I always think it's easier to describe it visually than with words. So here's another famous painting at the Art Institute of Chicago that's not Impressionist. It's from Rembrandt, a couple hundred years before Impressionism. Young woman at an open half door. So kind of somewhat of a similar subject. And then here's Renoir's work. So, wow, what is Impressionism? Well, usually a lot brighter colors, They usually a little bit slightly abstract. The picture on the left is almost photographic-like. Impressionists weren't trying to get a exact photographic-like depiction of people, but the colors also really stand out as well. And then there she is. She's got her shirt kind of slung over her shoulder, which you see that frequently in Impressionist works, including by Ronet. We'll actually see that again a little bit later. And she's standing there very poised. Here's her basket of laundry. So sometimes the women would do the laundry in the person's house. Sometimes they would pack it up and take it with them and bring it back. But she's got a really interesting pose here with her hands on her hips, looking out in the distance very matter-of-factly, and some great colors. And then here's another famous patron of the Art Institute of Chicago, Charles H. and Mary Wooster. And this is their Chicago home. He made his fortune in the lumber and paper business. And look at this is their living room. And the Renoir painting is situated among all these other great artworks. So imagine living in this home and having this Renoir, among other works, looking at you on a regular basis. Here's another famous Renoir painting. This is Acrobats at the Cirque Fernando from 1879. Renoir depicting modern Paris life. The thing with this one that's really interesting is acrobats are usually known for the way that they can position their bodies and contort themselves. But he's depicting acrobats here in a very different type of setting. It's after their performance, and he has them very graceful, like almost like they're dancers. So, interesting choice of subject matter in terms of depicting the acrobats not actually performing, but standing here very gracefully. And these are actually two sisters that were aged 14 and 17, although Renoir, for whatever reason, depicted them a little bit younger. And they are, the one girl on the right is holding oranges, and there's oranges on the ground. We'll explain why in just a moment. So these were two famous acrobats, and they ended up touring not only a good portion of Europe, but they actually came over here to the United States. And so here's an advertisement for them several years later. And this is interesting. One of the acrobats actually wrote a letter to her niece describing this painting. Now, you have to remember this letter was written in the era before the internet. And so I'm guessing that she probably got a postcard or a picture of this painting and sent it to her niece. I'm sending you now a little picture that will interest you. Acrobats. It is your mother, Francisca, and myself when we were beginning our careers as circus kids. The big one, of course, is your dear Ma, being 3 years my senior. So you see, I am the greedy one and collar most of the oranges the public thrown to us. So that's pretty cool. We have that. And circus performers and things of that nature were a common Impressionist subject matter. Here's another great painting by Renoir, a circus figure. This is at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Here's a famous painting by Degas, Miss Lala, and this was actually done at the same venue, the Cirque Fernando, 1879. Notice his depiction of the acrobat. She's actually performing, so very different approach than the one that Renoir took. And then here's Lautrec, also at the Cirque Fernando. And then here's some advertisements for it from back in the day. I think when most people now think of the circus, they think of animals and elephants and stuff like that. And while they did have those back then, it was a lot more human performers. So that's what you really see in the advertisements and the works. And this venue or this kind of organization is still in existence, although it's been renamed. It's now called the Circus Medrano, but it was previously the Circus Fernando. When this opened up, it was a big attraction. It was a really popular thing for people to come see this. Again, this is the era before the internet and radio and television, of course, people looking for interesting things to do. And that's why you end up seeing it depicted in so many different Impressionist paintings. And so again, the Impressionists and artists of this era depicting modern Paris life. And look at the turnout, the number of people in attendance for this. It was a really, it really was popular and gave some people something interesting to do. And of course, it was good for the economy because of the ticket sales and supported the performers, et cetera, et cetera. A little bit later, you might be familiar with the fact that Picasso, he frequently painted circus performers in his early works. And here are our two subjects. Now, notice she's holding the oranges. Um, it might seem kind of unusual now, but back in the day, oranges were a real luxury because they could only be grown in so many places. Now they have food shipped all over the world, so you can get pretty much any type of food at any time of year, anywhere in the world. Well, that wasn't always the case, and oranges were a real luxury item. And so what people would do is they would bring, I think if you heard about someone throwing fruit at a performer, you think they were unhappy with the performance, but it was the opposite. People knew that these young circus performers didn't make a lot of money, and they would bring oranges with them and throw them to the performers as kind of like a form of gratitude or appreciation. And so that's why the one girl scooped up a bunch of the oranges because they'll take them home and eat them. And again, the interesting contrast and approaches between circus performers in Renoir's work on the left and Degas on the right, which interestingly enough were both painted in the same year. And here's an artwork of oranges. Again, we take those so much for granted. I mean, now you just go down to Whole Foods or Kroger's or HEB if you're here in Texas and just pick up oranges whenever you want to, but that wasn't always the case. Barb asked, wouldn't the fruit get smashed if they were thrown? Then they probably a few of them would, but maybe though they take those and make orange juice out of them. And the ones that didn't get smashed, they would eat. Or people would throw them very gently, I guess. Here's a view of the top and the full view. So again, really cool painting by Renoir. Oh, and then I was going to mention, remember his mother and father were both in like the clothing business. So you really, if you're looking at Renoir's works, you should oftentimes pay attention to clothing because you can tell he put a lot of great detail and attention to that in his works. Another thing you frequently see in Renoir's works are what you, I guess you could call them domestic women. What I mean by that is not necessarily women that were at home all day, but women in kind of interior settings and frequently doing things like sewing and crocheting and needlework and stuff like that. So the painting on the left is at the Dallas Museum of Art, close to where I live. The one in the center is from the Clark Museum in Massachusetts, and the one on the right is from the Art Institute Chicago. And you can see a little bit of a time difference in those three, and also kind of different approaches. So quite a few similarities and differences between these three works. And here's the one in Dallas. This was actually Renoir's girlfriend of the time. And here's a girl crocheting. Notice the exposed shoulder again. And then this one at the Art Institute Chicago. So again, Renoir depicting female, doing kind of like domestic themes. He wasn't limited to sewing and crocheting. He would often do things like drinking a cup of coffee or tea or reading, things like that. But in this particular series, he's focusing on sewing and embroidering and things like that. And look at the beautiful light that's emitting from the top right of the painting, and also the great colors that Renoir uses, particularly a lot of blues in this one. And it's almost like a double portrait of the woman, and then also the flowers in the background. I mean, imagine how different it would be if you would have excluded the flowers. It would still be a really nice painting, but it really adds a neat touch. You're kind of, at least for me, my eyes kind of bounce back and forth between the woman and the flowers. Can't really decide which one to look at or focus on. And then here's those three works again. And again, it's the double portrait. If you're wondering what kind of flowers those are, they're asters and chrysanthemums. And again, that great light coming in from the top right. Renoir frequently wanted to focus on light and how it interacted with the colors of his works. And so you'll see that over and over again, just the really beautiful colors in this painting with the blues, among other things. And again, what is Impressionism? Well, here's a earlier work from a French artist by the name of Gérôme from 1851. And Gérôme, when he was alive, was one of the most famous painters in France. He's still a very important painter, but he's maybe not a household name like Renoir. But if you compare and contrast Renoir's work, so this is 1879 by Renoir, a French artist, and this is 1851 from Gérôme. And again, notice these differences. They're two women. The one on the left is much darker. The one on the right has a lot of lighter and brighter colors. Another thing you see frequently in Impressionism is the paintings are maybe not centered the way they are in traditional artwork. And then, of course, the one on the left, it looks almost like a photograph. And that's for the longest time what artists were striving for, is to make things look as realistic as possible. And then when Impressionists came along, they said, you know what, we're not going to do that. We're going to focus on light and colors and all these other things. So really kind of great classic example of the difference between Impressionists and work from before that. And then a close-up of the beautiful flowers. Look at the incredible details on that, and just the rainbow cornucopia of colors that he's chosen to portray. And then the woman deep in thought with her work, her rosy cheeks. And Renoir frequently does women with kind of reddish blondish hair. See that over and over again. All right, continuing on, here's a still life. This is from a trip to Naples, Italy that Renoir took in 1881. And in addition to being interested in art and music, Renoir was also a foodie. So when he went to Italy, he was really fascinated by the people and the culture and the artwork. And so he's depicting here Mediterranean culture. And he's showing these fruits and vegetables that you would find in Naples, Italy, that may or may not be the same as you'd find in France. And again, the great colors. Here is a beautiful still life of some chrysanthemums from 1881, 1882. Flowers are a really underappreciated subject for Renoir. What I mean by that is when people tend to think of Renoir's paintings, they tend to think of beautiful women and landscapes and things like that. But he was really interested in flowers. He did a number of still lifes throughout his career. Particularly of flowers. And Renoir, in addition to his many other interests, was also an avid gardener. So it makes sense that he would do flower paintings. And again, a great example of beautiful colors. Now, Renoir liked to do still lifes of flowers because he felt like there was a lot less pressure on him to perform, so to speak. So here's a quote from a letter he wrote to a friend talking about his interest in depicting flowers in his paintings. I just let my brain rest when I paint flowers. I don't experience the same tension as I do when confronted by the model. When I am painting flowers, I establish the tones. I study the values carefully without worrying about losing the picture. I don't dare do this with a portrait for fear of ruining it. There's a lot of interesting letters back and forth between Renoir and patrons of his where he was doing portraits of them and they were expressing their dissatisfaction with his work. Now, he was a very successful portrait painter, but I kind of get the impression it kind of stressed him out to a certain degree. And I think he was able to kind of release some of that stress by painting flowers because the flower is not going to complain about how they're depicted. And again, beautiful colors. This is one of the more famous Renoir paintings for our friends in New York City. This is a woman and her children and the family dog. from 1878. And this is one of the things that made Renoir so successful as an artist during his lifetime. He was very personable, and he got to know a lot of wealthy people. He ends up doing their portraits. For the most part, people were really satisfied with their portraits, and then they would hang them in their homes, and then their wealthy friends would come over and say, "Oh, that's a really cool painting. Who made that? Oh, this guy Renoir. You should meet him." And then he gets further commissions from that, and he's kind of mingling with all these different people. And so you contrast that with, like, say, someone like Van Gogh, who didn't really sell much of his work, but Van Gogh's not interacting with these kind of people. So this particular woman was very, very wealthy, and it's at one of the woman's salon events that he meets this woman and her husband, and they end up hiring him to do a commissioned portrait of her. So again, these are these wealthy salon patrons. When I say salon patron, I don't mean someone at the salon getting their hair done. I mean the salon where you go and talk about intellectual topics like literature and music and art and politics and stuff like that. And Renoir, being very personable, would go to these events, and he would meet these people, and then he would get commissions from them. So for much of his early and middle career, Renoir supported himself by doing these types of portraits. And this one particular woman's wearing this beautiful ball gown. This is from 1883. Yeah, word of mouth and networking, as Aaron says. But again, really beautiful portrait. Again, great colors. Here's a photograph of the husband, and then a photograph of his wife, who's in the portrait on the right. He was a wealthy businessman. And here she is, side by side with her painted portrait. And you might wonder, like, well, why were people still getting their portraits painted after photography was invented? Well, you can see the reason why, because it's a very different type of artistic endeavor. The painted portrait on the left, the photographic portrait on the right, and of course the fact that they don't have color at this point in time in photography helped as well. But it's much more of like a status symbol. Like someone that got this type of portrait painted would hang it in their living room, and then when they had company over, they'd be, "Oh wow, look at that." And of course, fashion is very important in Renoir's career. We talked about his parents. And so this particular woman's wearing her finest gown. And then notice the interesting contrast between the blue colors of her dress and then the red chair that she's sitting on. And also the blue of her dress matches perfectly the blue of her eyes, which is very striking. It's a really interesting use of color here. Notice she's wearing the gloves. Now, this particular couple commissioned Renoir to do a portrait of the wife, and his first attempt was not well received. So this is the first painting he did of her, and they didn't like it. They gave it thumbs down. They didn't like the fact that she was sitting in a garden. They thought this was like too country, so to speak, for lack of a better word. They wanted more of like a city or urban portrait. And so there was an interesting letter that Renoir wrote complaining about this couple to one of his friends. Basically like, hey, if they didn't want a portrait that looked like she was sitting in a garden, why did they agree to sit for that? But he made this painting 1882. They didn't like it. They refused to accept it. There was kind of some dialogue back and forth between Renoir and this couple. And then he ends up doing a second one, which kind of shows her more of like an urban city type of, wealthy woman. So interesting kind of, I think both of them are really beautiful. To me, they're both very beautiful in different types of ways. But if you go back, this is the one he made in 1883. And the year before, he had made this one, which is now in a private collection, and the two side by side. So if you were this woman, which one would you prefer? I don't know. They both look really nice to me. He did take very different approaches, but you know what? Maybe if they wanted the urban type of look, they should have explained that up front. But hey, those things happen. I should take a poll and see which one people like better. This painting was an interesting restoration project because they worked on it and discovered that the background colors were very, very different. The painting in its current format is on the left, and then this is a reproduction of what they think it would have looked like when Renoir painted. Notice the red background here has really faded a lot in the painting now, and they're not able to restore it. They sometimes can restore paintings to their original color. Sometimes they can't. It's just too risky. But they did kind of recreate it. And there's a cool video that the Art Institute Chicago made talking about their conservation department. So I wanted to cue that up in just a moment. But here it is in the lab. They're studying it with X-rays and all that kind of stuff. And so again, the painting on the left is what it looks like now. And the painting on the right is what they think it looked like when Renoir finished doing it. Notice how it's a really beautiful, striking painting now, but even more so back then with all that red background. Really interesting choice of colors on his part. And let's see, I'm going to cue this video up. Let me see if I can do this. And let's check this out.
I think about my work as an art detective. As museum scientists, we go around the galleries and the collection looking for clues on how things were made, how they may change over time, and thinking how best to preserve them. Take, for example, this paint. It's a beautiful pink paint, but appearances can deceive. Originally, its color was like this.
So here we have our Madame Capuçon painting, and we know from close examination that Renoir played with the color of the background. Getting the color right was really important to him. We notice this edge of unfaded pigment. It's really quite saturated.
In the 19th century, Renoir might have gone to a paint shop and picked a number of different scarlet colors. So how do we figure out exactly which pigment? What was the chemistry?
First of all, we use a surgical scalpel that you see here to take a microscopic sample, which is really, really small. You can barely see it. It's actually smaller than a human hair in diameter. And then we use a very powerful technique, which is called surface-enhanced Raman spectroscopy, to analyze the sample. We shine a laser onto the sample, and what we get is called the spectrum. It's like a fingerprint of your colorant.
We discovered that the pigment in Madame Capuçon background is derived from cochineal lake. And this is actually a colorant that was extracted from cochineal bugs. You need 70,000 of these bugs to make a pound of color.
Using this color, we then applied it to the upper layer of the background throughout and digitally made a version of the painting, which is here. And so this is a visualization of what the painting may have looked like after Renoir painted it. There are a lot of steps that we take to eliminate ultraviolet from natural and artificial light sources to keep the paintings as safe as possible.
Science solves a mystery. We've found Renoir's true colors.
It's really amazing how science increases our knowledge of art by doing all these techniques that they were talking about. And then going back to the paintings, so look at this. This is kind of female genre and portraits from Renoir, and you can kind of compare and contrast before. You can kind of see quite a few similarities between these works, but then there's also a number of differences as well. So interesting to kind of look at art this way when you kind of lay them all out and kind of look at them for patterns or differences or similarities, things like that. And then here she is again. And her beautiful blue eyes, it was a great choice to put her in a blue dress. You can kind of see a close-up of the background. She looks like she's getting ready to go off to the opera, perhaps. Oh, Carolyn brings up the new King Charles portrait, which was in the news this week. Yeah, I should have pulled that up side by side. Here's some other interesting paintings or noteworthy paintings from Renoir around the same time. So this is from 1883. This is one of a set of 3 that he did of couples dancing. This one's out in the country. This one is in the city. Oh, Lisa says this is her favorite Renoir painting. And here's another dance out in the country. Another thing that Renoir was well known for, portraits of children. So remember, he's making a lot of money off of commissioned portraits. And so he would oftentimes receive commissions to do portraits of children. And these are 3 famous children's portraits that Renoir did. The one on the left, the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, the one in the center, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the one on the right, of course, is the Art Institute of Chicago. And again, similarities and differences between these 3. Renoir was really talented as a painter, not only in his artistic depiction of people, but he was also very personable. He was able to kind of keep children engaged while he was doing their portrait. If you've ever sat for a painting, I did that once. It's a real tedious process. You got to sit still and don't move, particularly for a painting. And it's a real challenge if you're an artist working with children. But he was very engaging and kept the kids in line for the most part. He did write a couple letters where he was talking about the brats that he was painting, but that's to be expected. So this is the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. This is the daughter of a good friend of Renoir's. This girl, we don't know her identity, so the title is just Girl with Watering Can, but it's a famous Renoir at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And then this one at the Art Institute Chicago. So again, Renoir, his really bread and butter at this point in time in terms of income is doing portraits of people, these commission portraits. And he was very good at it. Notice her beautiful blue eyes. Now this one, he actually ended up doing several portraits of the various family members. So the gentleman on the left was a well-known banker and businessman who was very wealthy. And he hired Renoir to do several portraits of different members of his family, including his 3 daughters here. So here he is from 1879. Notice there's that red background again. King Charles would like that. And then here's the oldest daughter. This is at the Sao Paulo Museum of Art in Brazil. This is the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And then this is their youngest child at the Art Institute Chicago. So this gentleman was a banker. His daughter Lucy, age 3. Imagine how cool it would be to have Renoir do your portrait, and then your ancestors like, oh yeah, that's my great grandmother. She posed for Renoir. Notice this one, he used kind of a bluish green background, and that complements her eyes. And there's the father on the right, which is a very different approach with the reddish background and the darker colors, looking very serious. And there's the oldest daughter, a very different approach with the clothing and the pose between these 2 daughters. The older one and the younger one on the left was in Chicago. And then these are 2 different daughters. The one on the left, a painting in Art Institute Chicago. The one on the right, as I said earlier, is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. A little bit more informal when he picks the younger children versus, like, say, notice the formality of the father and then the formality of the oldest daughter, whereas the 2 younger children are much more informal. Bright eyes. All right, so I've used this term genre painting. I just wanted to make sure everyone was familiar with what that is. It's an art form that depicts aspects of everyday life by portraying ordinary people engaged in common activities One classic definition of a genre scene is that it shows figures to whom no identity can be attached, either individually or collectively, thus distinguishing it from history paintings and portraits. And so the painting on the left is a genre painting. We have two people, but we don't know who they are. And this is called Near the Lake from 1879, 1880. It's a genre painting. It's kind of that combination again of people and landscape in one painting. This is the modern Paris life again. This gentleman is a boater. We can tell that because he's wearing the hat that boaters used to wear in Paris around this time. And some people think that maybe it's a boater and his daughter. And there's the full view. He's smoking a cigarette with his hand on this railing, looking off into the lake. She's looking at him very attentively. When we did this program earlier, somebody said, I think she's telling him she's bored and she wants to go get ice cream, which sounds like a good enough explanation for me. But then again, notice the beautiful landscape in the background with the blues and the greens, and you can see boats here. Here's a little sailboat. Here's some other boaters over here. And again, this is near the lake, the beautiful colors and the great light. And this is also part of the Potter collection. We talked about that a little bit earlier. And there's a close-up. So what do you think's going on here? Is she telling him she's bored and wants to go get ice cream, or something else taking place? I guess I'll leave it up to your interpretation. And then one of the great art museums that's maybe not as well known outside the New England area is the Clark Institute in Massachusetts. I frequently feature their work. Here is a great example of Renoir's Box at the Theater, the concert from 1880. And I wanted to show this painting because notice it's two women. The one's looking at us very matter-of-factly. The other one is kind of looking down and it's kind of more of a profile view. This is the Clark Art Institute from 1880. And then a very famous Renoir painting from that time frame, it's at the Art Institute Chicago, is on the right. And okay, look at the similarities and differences between these two works. One's indoor setting, one's outdoor, and the depiction of two young girls. And again, a quote from Renoir, really kind of, I like this quote. It really sums up his philosophy as an artist. To my mind, a picture should be something pleasant, cheerful, and pretty. Yes, pretty. There are too many unpleasant things in life. It is that without creating still more of them. So really kind of like the key philosophical idea behind Renoir. So if you want to understand his work, it's really important to know that. And then this painting is known as Two Sisters, or sometimes called Two Sisters on the Terrace. It's from 1881. The dimensions 40 by 32 inches, or 101 by 81 centimeters. It's an iconic classic Renoir. It's one of his most famous paintings. And it's also one of the most popular works of art at the Art Institute of Chicago. And here's how the Art Museum described it: a striking juxtaposition of colors. And I think that really sums up this painting very well. And we talked about this woman before, Annie Swain Coburn, in her room or her apartment at the Blackstone Hotel. So here's the hotel, and then here's her room. And look at all these great artwork she has. Now the photograph, it's a little bit hard to tell, but above the piano here, you can see that Renoir painting, and it's kind of off in the corner here. But she donated a number of work, not just Renoirs, but all different types of paintings to the museum. It really helped increase the stature of the museum. So if you're wondering where all these came from. And here's the painting again. Yeah, people are saying in the chat their living room would look a lot better if it had a Renoir painting hanging in it. I would agree. So again, we kind of have that similar theme of the two young women or girls, and then in the background, this landscape. So you can actually, if you look closely, you can actually see there's a boater back here. And they're beautiful red and hat and blue dress. Here's the size of the painting. These are two people I don't know. I just happened to come across, it's like, oh, this would be good so people can see how the painting, the size of it. But this is, because this is one of the most popular paintings in the art museum, there's frequently people standing in front of it. So if you go visit the Art Institute of Chicago, you want to see this particular painting, just look for a large group of people. And then notice we saw this work a moment ago. And again, two sisters on the terrace. There's the dimensions. It's a pretty good size. They're pretty much life-size figures. They're not actually sisters. They know the identity of the woman in the center. She would later become a famous actress. They're not sure who the other younger girl is. They know it's not her sister, though. And the reason they know that is because she didn't have any sisters. The name was actually given by Renoir's art dealer. He thought that this would be, instead of calling it On the Terrace, he thought it'd be a lot more marketing savvy to call this painting Two Sisters, and it must have worked because it has become a very famous painting. And again, it's one of the most famous works in the Art Institute of Chicago. Two Sisters on the Terrace is one of the most popular paintings in the Art Institute of Chicago and one of Renoir's most famous works. Here, Renoir depicted the radiance of lovely young women on a warm and beautiful day. The older girl is posed in the center of the evocative landscape and gazes absently beyond her younger companion. Technically, the painting is a tour de force. Renoir juxtaposed solid, almost life-size figures against a landscape that, like a stage set, seems a realm of pure vision and fantasy. There's a close-up at the bottom. Look at those great colors. This is actually interesting aspect that Renoir did here that might not be readily noticeable. Remember the earlier painting where he had the woman that was crocheting, and then over to the right side there was a beautiful bouquet of flowers. Well, he does something a little bit similar here. This is actually a basket of different yarns. Now this is done at a restaurant. It's actually that same restaurant that we saw earlier. Probably they're on the terrace. So you might not be bringing a basket of yarns with you if you're going out to lunch. But people have theorized that he included this because it gives him a chance to increase the amount of colors in the painting. And so here's a close-up of it. And then, of course, her beautiful blue eyes and the colors of the flowers on her hat. Again, remember Renoir's mother and father were involved in the clothing industry, so you really see a lot of attention to detail in those types of aspects of his works. Oops. And close up at the top. And just a really incredible, stunning painting by Renoir. Again, that kind of combination of portrait, landscape, and the colors and the beauty. And so we've seen this format before. People posed in front of a beautiful landscape in the background. We've seen it 3 times in the Chicago works and the very kind of similar type of settings for all these. And again, these were all done at that restaurant west of Paris with the Seine River in the background with the boaters. And here's a little bit different from the portrait. This is another famous work at the Art Institute of Chicago. This is Grant Wood's classic American Gothic from 1930. And look at the comparison and contrast there. So very different. Renoir's pretty and pleasant painting, portrait type painting on the left, with Grant Wood's kind of stark portrait of the couple that was done at the beginning of the Great Depression. It's a couple from Iowa, so really interesting. And when I show you these comparisons, not to say that like one is better than the other. It's really just to look at art, kind of compare and contrast things, and you can really notice things when you look at work side by side like this. So I never mean to say I really like both of these works for different reasons, but again, the differences of the two works by the two artists, Renoir on the left and Grant Wood on the right. Interesting compare and contrast there. Again, they were not actually sisters. It was a name given to the painting by Renoir's savvy art dealer. And again, a close-up of the bottom. Close-up of the top or middle. And before we... So I'm kind of curious to know what our co-hosts think, and also our participants. So as you look at this painting, what do you see? What do you think? Let's check in with Brad and Patty to see how the two of them are doing. Brad and Patty, any thoughts on this painting when you look at it? Anything stand out or noteworthy for you?
Well, I just put a comment in the chat suggesting if people are really entranced with his styles and colors, they look for the movie that his son made, which I think is called Renoir, isn't it?
Yeah, we'll talk about that movie in just a few minutes. Yeah,
Okay.
that is a great film. I actually would like to stream that again because it is a really cool film.
I was thinking that because, yeah, every time I look at his paintings, I have memories of that movie and the ways in which he seemed to appreciate children, girls, women. It comes to life really in that movie. And so any of these paintings, especially that depict girls, women, children, it just screams Renoir to me, as well as the settings, the backgrounds and things, because that's also very lushly depicted in the movie.
Oh yeah, the nature and the colors, and thanks for making that connection because I hadn't brought that up just yet. So thanks, Patty. Appreciate it. Brad, what about any thoughts on this particular painting that you find noteworthy?
Yeah, I've loved this painting a couple of times we've seen it. I think even during one of the previous Renoir sessions this came up, and I'm really impressed with the young ladies, especially if you zoom them up a bit, you'll see they got especially the little girl has an awful lot of redness in her cheeks that
Oh yeah,
he
definitely.
successfully brought out. I'm not sure if that's rouge or if that's natural expression, and the other lady too has fairly red cheeks, and it was almost like a clown appearance in one degree, but
because it's like a rainbow with all these different colors he has in here.
He's done an awful lot of coloring on this, and if he's using those bugs that disintegrate after a while, you won't know what you're looking at in another 10 years.
Very true. Patty, any other thoughts on this one? What do you notice about this work?
I thought I didn't think my microphone was on. Yeah, I'm red is one of my favorite colors. So anytime I like the way he tends to use red, both as an accent and in the painting we saw about the restoration, he pops a lot of things with red, and then as you stare at it, you'll see like various shades suggesting red pop up. Like if you look at the boat in the background, there's a suggestion, a hint of reddishness in the boat. See what I'm and the hat kind of. So it makes you wonder like what it looked like when it was actually painted. I love red partly for that reason. It pops a lot of things.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I didn't make that connection about the boats and the red, so thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, yeah, as you cast your eye around the picture, I don't think you think consciously red, but if you center your gaze on the woman and then let your eyes drift, you start to see, oh, there's little flecks of red here and there that aren't really red, but the red sets off those little flecks.
Yeah, I really focused on these colors with the yarn and the flowers and the hat and the blues, but yeah, I didn't notice that before. So it's very unconscious.
Yeah, next to the woman's rib cage, like see even that little tiny trace of red. He seems to get reds in there, just in the right places where it just pops things.
Yeah. Oops. I was going to say, here's even some red, the stripe on the back of this chair. He's sneaking it in on us.
Exactly. And so I wonder where if it was like no accident that red hat on the older one is almost the center of the picture.
Oh yeah, it'd be a very different painting if she didn't have a hat all, or if it was blue or
Exactly.
black or something like that.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, like, is that exactly what he was going for, or was it a happy accident?
Yeah, was she actually wearing that hat? We got to get a photograph of. See if
And
this
was
was
it
modern.
red?
Yeah, if this was modern times, you go look at her Instagram page and see what she was actually wearing. But since they don't have that back then,
Yeah, exactly.
oh well. All right, well, let's continue on. Thanks, Brad. This is a really unusual painting for Renoir because he's not known as a seascape artist. You think of seascapes, think of maybe like, I don't know, Winslow Homer or somebody, but he did one here in 1879, so a very unique subject for Renoir to be doing seascapes. He's depicting here stormy weather, probably in the north of France. He's got great use of blues and greens in this one. Here's the full view. So I would think if people saw this painting and were tasked with guessing who the artist was, they probably wouldn't guess Renoir, I don't think. A close up at the top. And the middle and bottom. And sometimes artists just want to experiment and try new things. So maybe that's what he was doing here. And then we were talking about this couple before, the Palmer. So Potter Palmer on the left was a wealthy businessman, and his wife Bertha. They were important patrons of the Art Institute of Chicago. So Potter Palmer founded the company that would later become Marshall Fields. He opened up a department store called Palmer and Company. It was founded in 1852. He was initially running this by himself, but then he essentially hooked up with some other people, and the store kind of expanded or grew into what would become known as Marshall Fields. And so he made a fortune in the retail business. And of course, Marshall Fields, synonymous with Chicago. So he played a very important role in that regard. And then if you've been to Chicago, the Palmer House Hotel, just out in 1870, he also built that. It's now a Hilton. If you're looking for like a old school, old money kind of fancy hotel in Chicago, you can check out the Palmer House. And then they were also the founders of Lakeshore Drive, which is also synonymous with Chicago. It's part of what's called the Chicago Gold Coast. So they were the first couple to build a big giant mansion on Lakeshore Drive. And then when they opened it up and moved in there, a lot of their friends did the same. And so they're really the founders of Marshall Fields, the Palmer House Hotel, and then the Lakeshore Drive Gold Coast area in Chicago. So the Palmer's really important in Chicago history. Look at their room here on the right that's just covered with artwork. Much of that artwork ended up at the Art Institute of Chicago. So again, if you're wondering why they have such an incredible collection there, you'll know. And so these are 4 Renoirs that they donated to the museum. So that's pretty cool. So shout out to their gratitude. And here's another famous Renoir painting. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. This is Renoir's future wife. And a little bit later, he did this famous painting at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, The Great Bathers. So for our friends in Pennsylvania, you might have seen this work. It's a very large painting. It's one of Renoir's most famous works, The Great Bathers, Philadelphia Museum of Art. The connection this has to Chicago, though, is Renoir did a preparatory drawing that is in the collection. So he did this in chalk and crayon. It was a study for the Great Bathers. Renoir was really interested in female bathers as a subject. Here's a really interesting quote from Renoir. "It's with my brush that I make love. Oh my goodness." That's what Renoir had to say. And so you can see the original drawing on the left and then the finished painting on the right. I always find it fascinating when you see these preparatory works to see how they're different. So like, for instance, notice the woman's hands. on the left are positioned differently in the original drawing than on the right. So at some point in time, he must decide that, oh, I think it would be better if her hands were this way. And then a few other differences as well. So interesting that they have that in the collection. So if you're familiar with the work in Philadelphia, you might want to visit Chicago and check out the early work. Then here's self-portraits that Renoir did of his later years in chronological order. This is Grove of Trees. This is a watercolor. This is also a very unusual painting for Renoir. Didn't do a lot of watercolors. This particular work does not have, it has the colors that you would expect to see in Renoir, but very different. I would imagine if you saw this in your grandparents' attic or basement or at a flea market, you wouldn't jump all over this Renoir painting, but it's a watercolor study. They were thinking that he was going to do a bigger painting based on this, but they don't know of any such work that he ended up completing. But it's beautiful nonetheless. And then here is Renoir's son, Jean. Now, it might look like a girl because she has long hair, or he has long hair, sorry, and sewing. But children back in this day, it was hard to distinguish between boys and girls because it was common both in Europe and in America even to children, both boys and girls, to let their hair grow long. And this is actually what when Patty was referring to earlier, the 2012 film Renoir. This figure, Renoir's son Jean, is one of the key characters in the movie. And remember, we were talking before about Renoir, the children's portraitist, and also the great use of color with oranges and reds. And then here's his son later in life. He would become a famous film director, Jean Renoir. It's the same family. And then here is that film. It came out in 2012. I was going to screen it again, perhaps later this summer. So if you want to go check it out, you can find it on your own. If you want to wait, we'll probably stream it again at some point in time in the future.
Shelley mentioned that it's now showing on Prime, I think.
Amazon Prime. All right. Good job. And then here is the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond is a really great museum. If you've never been there before, and you're going to be going out to the Mid-Atlantic area in Richmond, Virginia, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, a beautiful art museum, architecturally has a great collection. Admission is free. And here's a painting that they have in their collection by Renoir. It's the artist's son, Jean, drawing. So this is from 1901. Notice his hair is much shorter. And so the earlier work on the left, which some people might think is a girl, and then the later one. So that was just kind of customary for boys and girls to have their hair grow long. And then at some point in time, if it was a boy, they would cut it short, which is on the right. So this painting on the right is only 1 year after the one on the left. So I just thought I would include.
Robert,
yeah,
sorry, but I just have a question.
Sure.
Looking at this, there's cute ribbons in the boy's hair, and that's that kind of leads me away from thinking it's a boy.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, even like the clothing, the kids tended to wear like these dress type things, but it was just kind of the style. But if you look at pictures of American kids, you oftentimes find the same thing. But yeah, the ribbon in the hair and sewing might confuse a few people, but that's the way it is back then. Oh, someone says, Susan says the movie is also on Apple TV. Thanks, Susan.
Yes, and on Freebie, somebody else said too. So it's around. It's around.
Okay. Yeah, it talks about it. Kind of showcases Renoir's later years, but interesting film nonetheless. And then here is Renoir. Someone asked earlier if they thought they heard that Renoir had arthritis, and he did. Yeah, in his later years, his arthritis was really severe. He had a hard time picking up brushes and mixing paint, so he would have assistants do that for him. His arthritis got so bad that he had to have the paintbrush essentially like strapped into his hand so that he could paint. But he essentially continued on painting until the day he died. He liked art, making artwork so much. And he was also confined to a wheelchair. And by this point in time, he's wealthy, he's famous, he's accomplished. He doesn't have to keep painting; he just wants to, and so that's what he does up until around the time that he passes away. And then here's another one of the Bather series that he was fond of. So at this point in time, he's living in the south of France. This is 1914. This is what we'd call an idealized figure of a woman. What I mean by that is you can't put like a certain identity or personality on the woman. Like, for instance, a Statue of Liberty. That's an idealized woman. Everyone can tell it's a woman, but she looks different than maybe just, say, a regular person walking off the street. This is very interesting. It's a very curvilinear figure. And then also we see these reds and oranges that he's so well known for. We actually know the identity of this woman. Her name was Madeleine Bruno. She worked for Renoir, and he ended up doing quite a few different portraits of her. Now, in real life, she looked a little bit different. Her hair was much darker, and she was a little bit thinner in real life, as you can tell by the photograph. And if you see other depictions that Renoir made of her, she sometimes looks more like she did in real life or like in the photograph. But this particular image that Renoir went for, he was not trying to make an exact, say, photographic representation of her. We talked about the importance of that in Impressionism. Here is another portrait of the same woman. It's in a private collection from 1914. Here you can see she has the darker hair. In this work, which Renoir did in 1914, she has the reddish hair that Renoir was very fond of. Now, she could have gone down to Sally Beauty Supply and picked up some red coloring, but I don't think that happened. So artists think that he just changed the color of her hair. And there you go. The one in Chicago is on the left, and the one in the private collection is on the right. You can see the rosy cheeks. Later in his career, Renoir experimented with sculpture, which is unusual. You can see artists go into different forms. This is a bronze sculpture called Water. He made a number of sculptures frequently depicting women, laundry type women or women doing laundry, things like that, or having these bather type themes as well. It's a really interesting sculpture because it's more of a three-dimensional form than a regular two-dimensional painting. And so you can see these in different museums throughout the world. And again, I think maybe if you weren't familiar with the fact that Renoir was a sculptor, you might look at this and not realize that he made this artwork, but he did. He was experimenting. If you go back to the, so look, Renoir's born in 1841, and yet in the mid-19 teens, he decides to branch out and experiment with sculpture. And then this was a admirer of Renoir's who came to visit him, Albert Angeret, and he asked if Renoir would pose for him, which he did. And it just so happens they have this portrait in the Art Institute Chicago. So you can see Renoir. He's seated in this chair. He's got his palette in his left hand and his paintbrush in his right hand. And this was done just a few years before Renoir died. It was done in 1914. Renoir passed away in 1919. Pierre-Auguste Renoir was born on February 25th, 1841. He lived to the ripe old age of 78. He passed away on December 3rd, 1919. If you want to go pay your respects to Renoir and visit his grave site, he's buried about 2.5 hours southeast of Paris. He's born in the hometown of his wife. They lived there for a number of years. Renoir and his wife met in Paris. When he became a successful artist, they later moved to her hometown, 2.5 hours away from, well, 2.5 hours away now. It would have taken much longer back then. And then later on, they moved to the south of France, but he and his wife are both buried in her hometown. You can visit his gravesite and pay your respects. That's a sculpture of him on top. Here's his grave marker. Maybe not quite as elaborate you expect for such a famous artist, but that's what it is. And here's a close-up of the sculpture. Nicely done. All right, so just kind of a summary of the things we talked about. Renoir, his style, beautiful, warm colors and light, the style of pretty and pleasant subjects, nothing bad or dark or disturbing. The primary subject was women, often fashionably dressed, sometimes nude. Additional subjects he liked was modern Paris life, these genre leisure scenes, children, landscapes, still lifes, etc. He had a lot of artistic friends and wealthy patrons. He was very personable, and I would probably sum up his works as lovely and exquisite. And here are some of the works again, all on the same page. And again, to me, Renoir is, while many of his works are a little bit different from one another, it kind of seems to me like you can kind of identify his works just because the style and the colors and the way he depicts people. Sometimes it's not as easy to do with an artist because their styles and things change over time. But in my opinion, his works are a little bit easy to associate with one another. And then if you want to learn more about like all the technical aspects of Renoir's works, like remember we watched that video, they were talking about the conservation of that painting. Information like that and how he put the paintings together and the types of paint he used and all that kind of stuff. There's a free online resource called Renoir, Paintings and Drawings at the Art Institute Chicago. If you just Google it, it'll come right up and you can go through that at your leisure. And then as I mentioned earlier, this is the third of a four-part series we're doing on Renoir. The first one was featuring Renoir's works. It was just like this, except it featured his works at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The second one in New York. The second one was on the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, which included them because they have the world's largest collection of Renoir works. The Barnes has 181 of Renoir's works. So if you want to watch those, you can find them on YouTube. This particular program today, where we'll be recording it, we'll paste it on our YouTube channel. It'll take us a few days to do that, but you can be on the lookout for that. And then in August, late August, August 24th, we'll do a program just like this, except we'll feature the Renoir works that are at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And again, Renoir and Impressionism is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You can find it on YouTube. Renoir and Impressionism at the Barnes, also on YouTube. And I want to thank our viewers for pushing us over the 1 million views on YouTube. Greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much. That's very flattering. To think that 1 million people have watched our recorded programs. Very cool. Thank you very much. And then there are Renoir and Impressionism program at the National Gallery of Art. We'll kick that off Saturday, August 24th, and learn about Young Woman and a Cat, among other works. All right, and then as I mentioned earlier, we have a program coming up just like this, except talking about the Monets in Chicago, and we'll be doing that tomorrow. We'll be using the same Zoom link, so if you signed up for that, we'll see you then. If you didn't sign up, just hold on to the same Zoom link. That program is going to be at 10 o'clock Eastern, 9 o'clock Central. I included the links for the YouTube programs and then the Monet stuff in the email I sent out that had the Zoom stuff, and then one of my favorite artists is Georgia O'Keeffe, and on Saturday, June 1st, we're going to be doing a program on Georgia O'Keeffe's time in New York City because they have a big art exhibit in Chicago called Georgia O'Keeffe's My New Yorks, which features all these really cool paintings that Georgia O'Keeffe made of New York City while she was living there. So you can be on the lookout for that. And
Robert, just to clarify, the YouTube channel is under Washington, D.C. History and Culture, right?
correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
A lot of people aren't making that connection. I know it's right across the top, but people keep asking what's the name.
No problem. Sometimes people are listening or watching on their phone or whatever. Any final thoughts, Patty or Brad, before we sign off?
Just, I mean, I'm always bowled over by the lushness of his work. I mean, to me, there's never any doubt that he really loves what he's doing. And again, and you can pick up the difference and say the commission portraits because he's trying to satisfy somebody else. You can kind of tell the difference between the ones he's doing for his own pleasure versus the commissions, which of course paid the bills. But yeah, that's why I thought halfway through of recommending the film, not knowing you were going to talk about it, because it just bowls me over, that sense of richness and involvement. And the other factor is that he really conveys a sense of inner life and engagement in his subjects.
Oh yeah, he does. I mean, they're just so lively. And yeah, you can tell. I don't know. To me, just you can tell he was a happy person.
Yeah, yeah.
Brad, what about you? Any final thoughts on Renoir?
We can't hear you, Brad.
Oh, I think Brad stepped away for a minute. Well, that's okay.
Okay.
So again, we'll call. Oh, go ahead. No, okay. So again, we'll call it a day, and then if you're interested,
Get
go
back.
ahead.
I was trying to get back to my main screen. I was trying to deal with a couple of things in the chat. I just am bowled over by this guy. His art is phenomenal, and the amount of effort that people put into donating to make that art institute in Chicago. No wonder it's so highly recommended, and it's the top of the list.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Happy Friday. Thanks to Brad and Patty. Let me do this. Let me pause the program. If you're interested, I thought what I would do is, oops, hold on one second.
Oh, Jen's saying